And welcome everyone to today's Synergist webinar, using ISO 45001 to enhance your industrial ergonomics program. I'm Kay Bechtold, Managing Editor of the Synergist, the magazine of AIHA. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Velocity EHS for sponsoring this webinar. Today's speakers are Rick Barker and Carly Sorgini. Rick Barker, Senior Director of Solution Strategy for Velocity EHS, facilitates knowledge-building activities relating to safety management systems, industrial ergonomics, human performance, and human factors. Rick holds a Master of Arts degree in Human Factors from the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, and he has achieved recognition as a CPE and CSP. Carly Sorgini is a senior strategic consultant for Velocity EHS and works with clients to support the implementation and management of their ergonomics processes to help them achieve their business objectives. Carly received a Bachelor of Engineering degree in biomedical engineering from the University of Guelph. She has also achieved recognition as a certified professional ergonomist. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Rick and Carly.
All right, thank you very much. Let me get the correct slide up there. Okay, and we should be good to go now. So we're talking about ISO 45001. We're going to begin with some general information and then move into about ISO 45001 and then move into some results that we have in terms of some common challenges in implementing it and where people are doing well and where they're struggling a little bit more in it. So as we'll leave plenty of time for question and answer at the end of this. So please enter any of your questions. One of our favorite parts is going through and looking at and addressing those questions. So I want to really just start out with, not a new concept, but the focus of our attention that the most effective safety programs are consistently the ones that are built on continuous improvement models. Now, it matters less which specific improvement model they're built on, but rather that they're following that process that's going to gather the feedback, set out a plan, implement the plan, gather feedback, and make updates to that plan, regardless of the method that's being used. So we're going to focus and talk about Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's probably the most common one and also the one that we see in ISO 45001 and other ISO standards, as well as in ANSI 10. So as we look through this, we're going to see a lot of overlap between the Short cycle or the PDCA and the steps in the process. We're really going to be focusing on a couple elements of it, not going to break these out into huge details with the specific step numbers here as we go through, but more just to talk about this section of it where we're in the Plan, Do, Check, Act elements of it and how those relate to the ISO 45001 and also where people are doing well in it. So when I look specifically at ergonomics and how it links well to ISO 45001, first, just kind of step back and look at, the big picture with it. And while there are other areas in health and safety and environmental where we can end up focusing an awful lot on compliance and specifically just the documentation side of it rather than managing and reducing risk. With the limited standards that exist for requiring ergonomics, there's usually even a greater emphasis on just the whole idea of the management of risk there. So makes for a very nice fit. The fact that we focus on prioritizing activities um, is another good one. Um, Generally, ergonomics has been very good at getting the engagement and involvement of frontline employees. You'll hear a lot about terms like participatory ergonomics. Many people doing ergonomics have an ergonomics team that involves frontline employees. So it's already doing a number of the things that we'd be wanting to have for ISO 45001. But that doesn't mean that all of them are in place. So let's dive into these a little bit. Um, talked about participatory ergonomics and frontline workers. And some of the ways that we look for involvement there, certainly workplace improvements. That one there's a real long history of. Identifying hazards, also good, strong history of with ergonomics. As we move into some of these ones further down my list, we see diminishing amounts of getting that frontline worker participation involved in selecting the priorities, doing audits and reviews of the program, and in setting the policy and the plans for an organization. And that's really where some of the biggest opportunities lie to improve the programs, but also have better um, compliance with ISO 45001. So one of the things that I encourage folks to do, and don't need to scramble to write this down or take any screenshots or anything. The presentation is available as a PDF for everyone. But I would encourage you to actively think about each of these four things of ways that you can increase that frontline employee involvement. And then as we look to our senior leadership for their participation and consultation, where I suggest that organizations start when they're thinking about what that leadership participation should be in it is rather than some specific questions, step back and look at what does good senior leadership participation in either safety or ergonomics look like to you? And for me, um, it's more one of those things of like, I know it when I see it. But trying to put that into words would be things like um, my senior leadership understands the priorities that we're working on for ergonomics and the status of those priorities and the challenges or barriers that we may be facing in trying to accomplish those. If they have that level of engagement with the process, that usually means that um, you know they're uh, they're paying attention, they're engaged and involved. Um, where this falls down a lot, though, is that oftentimes we have clear ideas of what good would look like for their participation, but that hasn't always been communicated to the senior leadership about what we need from them for it. I mean, a lot of times we'll talk about, oh, we need you to provide resources, and maybe we need you to push for accountability. I would drive to trying to get a little more specific than those if you want to push it to the next level. Whenever I'm working with an organization on ISO 45001 or just in setting up their processes and plans, I compare what they're trying to do, what they're setting out to do with planning a vacation. And as you put in your MapQuest or Google Maps or whatever else you're using, and for how you're going to get there, the first thing that you need to know is, where do you want to end up? What destination do you want? So that's really that overarching goal for your process is that destination. You also need to know where you are currently. And that requires some objective assessment of where your strengths are, where your gaps are in your process. And then if we look across the top of the map, we see things like, I'm going by car, I'm going by public transport, I'm going by airplane, or I'm walking. And these are really the resources that you have at your disposal. And that's going to define, among other things, how long it takes you to get there. But it's also going to define things like your path along the way. Are you going to be, low budget and carrying a tent the whole way for your trip? Or, are you taking the flight and you'll get there quickly, but you've got more expenses? Um, the other elements that we'll call out in that then that don't fit the map one so quite so well are what are the roles and responsibilities, who's in charge of snacks for the road trip, and what does the scope of what you're trying to accomplish look like? So when we transfer this over to the field of ergonomics, we want to set this overarching goal, something that you can sum up real quickly for folks and they'll understand what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go. And so some examples from that would be like reducing your risk to the lowest level that's technically and financially feasible. It might be instead of lowest level of risk, it might be eliminating high MSD risk exposures. You'll see in both of these that we talked about existing and new jobs, so that we're trying to hit both ends of the not just what we bring into the facility is good, but we are going back and fitting stuff there in the facility also to reduce risk. So when we talk about resources, this is a quick informal assessment that you can do that can kind of help define what types of things you're going to need. I broke improvement types into 4 buckets. Things that people can do for themselves, things that you're going to need maintenance to do, uh, stuff that you can order on your budget or your department budget without any problem, and things that you're going to have to get capital expenditure approval for. So the big purchase items. And the type of improvements that you need are going to not only define, what monetary resources you need, but they're going to define who's on your ergonomics team, what type of training you need to roll out for ergonomics in your organization, what type of pace you can expect to move along at. So all of these become a good thing to think about as you're scoping your process and you're setting your metrics, what things you're going to measure, and also what your targets or goals are for that. When we look at the Plan, Do, Check Act, so I would kind of break those out as saying, you have your risk assessment and your root cause analysis. That's your planning phase. As you put in your corrective and preventative actions or your controls, that's your do phase. You have a check with your verification and follow up where that can lead to standardizing and making sure that you build that into trainings and your other work processes, which lead back to more risk assessments and so forth. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that plan, do, check, act cycle also happens at each one of these steps. So you can keep going into finer and finer detail in terms of what you're doing. You plan what risk assessments you're going to do. You complete those. You check on how well those are done if you're using your ergonomics team, and then you may have to adjust your training or adjust your assessment tool if it's telling you that every job is high risk or that no jobs are high risk. So that process repeats in each one of the steps at a more detailed level as well. Now, there are a lot of different risk assessments that you can use in ergonomics. And what I might choose to use for a detailed assessment as, someone who has decades in ergonomics could be very different than what I want an ergonomics team to do. The things I focus on from an assessment standpoint is making sure that I can get the same answers each time I do it and with each person that is doing it so the results are consistent. I want something that's simple enough that I can have lots of people engaged in doing assessments. I want it to be sensitive enough that I can use it to help set priorities. And finally, that it gives me a level of detail that's useful as I try and do that root cause analysis and move into my corrective and preventative actions. As I get into the do phase, um, one thing that I find happens a lot in ergonomics is that we spend an awful lot of time down on the bottom half of the hierarchy of controls. So we have a whole lot of wanting to do things through coaching somebody how to do it better, giving them some stretches to do, maybe put in some job rotation, and not as much focused in the higher levels of the hierarchy of control where we're actually changing what that risk exposure would be. And one of the things that can help us as we're looking at these different solutions, at different ideas that we have, is to map these out in terms of their impact and their ease and difficulty to implement. And so the impact is going to almost directly correspond or will directly correspond to what the hierarchy of controls looks like, um, as long as you're addressing the risks that are in the job. And then comes the difficulty. There are equipment changes that are pretty easy to do. There's also ones that are going to be incredibly difficult to do. And so this chart, if you're high and to the right, so if you're in the upper right of the A quadrant, those are the no-brainers to do. That's where you want to be putting a whole bunch of your time, and you just want to stay away from that bottom left quadrant altogether. And so as we go through this, it's important to have a good sense of what you're going to do for metrics. And you want a combination of metrics that are leading metrics and ones that are output metrics, lagging, results oriented. Um, if I only ever base mine, my how my program's doing off of the injury reduction, well, with the amount of time that it takes musculoskeletal disorders to develop, it could be quite a while before I find out whether my program is even headed in the right direction. And so that's where the leading metrics really come into play. Making sure that you have those in place. You can see that you're on the track that you think you should be on. And then as you've been doing it longer, you can start to see those outcomes. And if you're not getting quite the outcomes that you're looking for from a result standpoint, go back and change what you're doing on that front end. One of the things that I want to point out is that when you're implementing ergonomics, the things that you would do in the first couple years of an ergonomics program are going to be much different than the things you do as your process matures. You want to measure different things. So I might start out, and one of the first things I'm doing is looking at the number of people who've completed training, the number of assessments that I've made. Then I might move to the number of workstation improvements I implemented. I might look at the number of those. I might move later to the number of those that were engineering controls and I might be 3 years, 4 years in before I'm really able to look at how many of those jobs have I reduced the risk in? And that's really where we want to be moving to, is what's going on in terms of risk reduction, because that's what's going to drive the injury reduction. So, Carly, you want to take over here? I need to let you do that though, don't I? Well, I did that wrong.
No problem.
Yeah. And now, there you
Awesome.
go.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. All right, I'm going to take some time here to talk through some common challenges as well as some strategies and best practices for addressing those challenges. Specifically going to hone in on some areas that we identified during a recent analysis of some ergonomics program self-assessment results. So just a quick backstory on what that is. We being certified professional ergonomists at Velocity EHS, created an ergonomics program self-assessment to help our customers quickly assess their current ergonomics plan. So it's very interactive. You go in, it follows the plan, do, check, act cycle and aligns with ISO 45001 and ANSI Z10. So the self-assessment is just a really good check to look at whether you're aligning with a lot of these things that Rick just talked through. And once you go through and answer all the questions, it helps identify specific strengths in your process as well as areas for improvement. And then from that and how you answer those questions, it also provides some customized recommendations to address those areas for improvement as well. So that self-assessment, it is broken into 6 key areas that we see here. And these are the results from the analysis that we did. So it has policy, management review, plan, do, check, and act. And within each one of those sections, there's about 7 questions. So you can get 14 points in each of these sections. And it will, again, help identify which areas you might need to focus on a little bit more for the coming year. So we did analyze the results late last year from 311 different responses. I do want to highlight quickly the error bars that we see on there. So they are quite large, and that's because our responses, they came from organizations from many different industries, organizations of many different sizes, different levels of maturity, and all of that. And so obviously that'll impact how you're answering each of those questions, each of those things. The general trend in responses that we did see, though, is what we see here, with policy and do tending to score the highest. I wasn't overly surprised to see the do section come out so, like, as one of the highest categories here. It is, in my experience, it is one of those areas that I tend to see companies build up a lot of strength in, right? Of doing a lot of those tactical activities, getting their training done, having methods in place for their operators to report discomfort, doing assessments, identifying improvements, all of those things companies can tend to get very good at doing. And then we start to see them lose just a little bit of strength as they get further into the PDCA cycle, which is what we're seeing with these results here as well, with the check and act sections tending to score a little bit lower overall. And that's why some of the challenges that I'm going to talk through in a second here are specifically related to the check and act phases of our continuous improvement process. I just want to start out with a quick example of one of the key areas of the self-assessment. So this is one of the first sections, policy. We can see a couple different examples of those questions that are included in the policy section there. Each question, you basically go in and you rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 2, with 0 being rarely doing these things, 1 being we sometimes do these things, and 2 being we usually do these things. So looking at this example here of the policy section, in general, companies are sometimes or usually doing most of the components captured within the policy section. That's what we were seeing from those results. Where they lost a little bit of strength was in that second element: do frontline workers review and contribute ideas to the policy? So that one's a little bit lower than the others, which wasn't overly surprising to see either, but it is very important to note. And Rick spoke earlier about some ways that we can proactively make sure that workers are getting involved in the entirety of the process, because we tend to do fairly well with getting them involved in the job improvement process itself, but not so much at those more strategic level activities like policy and plan and review and all of that. That takes more of a proactive approach. All right. First, I want to talk through some of the top scoring elements from the self-assessment responses. So those are highlighted in this table here. Won't be talking through these in too much detail. We want to talk a little bit more through those lagging ones, but did want to highlight what some of those most successful things overall were that companies were indicating. So where people felt they had where people in general had the highest response rates for doing them, the very first thing on our list here was the hierarchy of controls. So really overall happy to see that people feel they're utilizing the hierarchy of controls when they're implementing their improvements. Like Rick mentioned earlier, we tend to see people operating more in the bottom half of that hierarchy of controls, but it is really important that we are focusing on those engineering improvements and those workplace changes and things like that to have impactful improvements that are going to result in the greatest risk reduction. So companies tended to indicate that they felt like they were doing this, which is good to see. Other things on here, how well people are reducing their MSD risk exposure. The fact that people are following that up and documenting that, that's terrific to see. Having a policy in place, including it in your EHS auditing, having a scope, having an overall goal that's focused on risk. Companies felt like they were doing these things well, and that's awesome. These are things that Rick spoke to the importance of earlier on. So that's really good to see. And then the final item was, do you do something with the results that are coming out of your assessment process? And the general consensus was yes. So these were some of our top scoring elements. I'm going to get into more of our lagging ones now. So the most lagging element, and not overly surprised seeing this when we saw the results, because, you know, based on conversations that I'm having with companies and assessments that we've done with companies and things like that, we do see this quite often, but the most lagging one being holding the managers of the areas accountable for individual ergonomic performance goals. And this is a very common challenge. Like I said, I'm sure we've all faced some challenges with accountability at some point or other. You know, I always think back to school when a teacher assigned an assignment and it was an optional assignment, right? And if you wanted to do it, you could better your learning, you could get stronger at a skill, whatever it was, but it was optional, it wasn't graded. And so there was always one or two individuals in the class that, you know, they just wanted to learn more, they loved school and they would do that assignment, and that was awesome, but no one else would do it because it wasn't graded, it wasn't really worth anything, right? The same kind of goes for ergonomics. If our goal is that we're going to do 5 improvements this year that reduce MSD risk exposure, and the manager is the one that's going to have to approve the budget for these projects and approve the time for them and all of that, and you only end up completing one for the year, it probably needs to affect their performance evaluation that they're not achieving those goals that are set out for their area. And that means having senior leadership that's also going to hold them accountable and is going to follow through with this as well. Some other lagging items that we found: establishing program audit criteria. This one was interesting as well, because if I go back to our previous slide here, we'll see that one of our strengths, we said, was that ergonomics is included in EHS auditing. Yet as one of our lagging items, we're saying we didn't necessarily establish what those audit criteria are. So that's good to know, right? Here's a great opportunity to do a better job of establishing what should be measured on based on what our plan and policy and process is, so the results that we get out of that audit are even better. The ROI component of it, I'm going to speak to that one a lot more. We went ahead in a couple of slides here. I'm going to speak to that one a lot more in a second here. So I'm just going to gloss over that for the time being. 5th one down, I think, on the 4th one down on the list here, regularly communicating metrics. That was noted as a lagging element. If that's lagging, that's something that's pretty easily changed. We just need to come up with a plan for that, so long as you're actually tracking those. If you aren't tracking those, that's an even bigger problem. Incorporating lessons learned. Again, I'm going to speak to that in a bit more detail in a second here. So I'm going to skip over that one. Second last one was frontline workers reviewing and contributing ideas to the policy. Again, this is a common challenge. We talked about it very briefly there when I was going through the policy section. But again, we often get them engaged in the job improvement process, but not as often in the policy and program area. So it's important to one, identify that that's an issue, and two, make a proactive approach to address that, right? So for example, again, looking at some of our strengths that we indicated here, we said that our process reviews, they're resulting in follow-up actions. That's awesome. That means someone is reviewing it, someone's determining actions. So let's make sure that we've got some frontline involvement in then doing that review and contributing ideas for what we should be doing to make those enhancements. And it just takes a bit more of a proactive approach to getting them involved in those more strategic activities. And then the last one, workplace changes, things like staffing levels, production volumes, resulting in new ergonomics assessments being performed. Weren't necessarily doing this as often. It's a lagging element here. And this is really a management of change issue. But when you've got workplace changes, you need to have a clear process for when do those need to be communicated for doing an ergonomics risk assessment. Right? So for example, if we're doing a continuous improvement event at my facility, I would work into that. Anytime I do a continuous improvement event that results in workplace changes, there's going to be an ergonomics assessment at the end of that, right? So I would build that in. Okay, so I want to talk through in a little more detail some common challenges in the ACT phase, or the sustain it portion of things, like we like to call it here at Velocity EHS. I'm first going to talk through why they're important, because I do find one of the reasons there tends to be gaps in the first place is that people don't really even fully understand why they would want to do it. So I'm going to talk through why each of these things are important and how we can kind of overcome them and do these things. So why would we even want to do the ROI of improvements in the first place? Well, first thing there, we're speaking the language of business managers. So they're the ones that are going to help define or set the resources for your program. If we can put the information back in a way that's easily understood for them, that's only going to help us in the long term. It's also one of the ways of verifying the effectiveness of your process. So the degree to which you're achieving results is going to speak well to your program. And that's one way that we can verify the effectiveness of our program. Thirdly, organizations that are most successful with ergonomics have been demonstrating value to their organization. It's really important to demonstrate value to the organization. So this is one of the ways that you can do that. And then the final one I'll point out is certainly we want to do safety and we want to do ergonomics just based on the idea that it's the right thing to do. And a lot of our leadership definitely supports that this is the right thing to do, but it's even easier to support doing the right thing when the right thing is also bringing us a return on investment that we can see financially. So that's some of the why side of it. Now, how do we do that? Well, one of those is accurately conveying injury savings. So if we can accurately define the amount that we're saving in injuries by looking at average injury costs, taking into consideration historic rates, all of that, and not overly inflating that number, that's going to be super powerful. There's also a number of other areas that we can get information from that we haven't always done a great job at, but things like productivity, so decreased downtime can be a big one, time saved, looking at things like quality, if there's been this quality issue kind of hanging over our heads that we've addressed when we made this ergonomics improvement, let's show that. Hiring, do I have increased turnover? Do I have a problem finding capable employees because the physical demands of the job are so high that I'm ruling out people? Absenteeism, or even quantifying some of the engagement that goes with it. So those are all opportunities for doing that. Incorporating the lessons learned into the design process. So for most organizations, when you bring in new equipment or you add a new product, it's not totally different than things you've done in the past. It's usually some variation or iteration or some growth from other things that you've done. So there's things that you can learn from that and then incorporate when a similar process is brought in. Design guidelines are a great starting place, but they aren't always enough to get to the very specific challenges you faced in the past. And so this allows in the design process to know which of these design guidelines are most important. What did we use in the past? And it can be a little bit overwhelming for engineers to just have all this design guideline and all this additional information just thrown at them if this isn't their first priority. And in most instances, it is not their number one priority. So if we can make it simpler for them, if we can define what that actually is, that's going to get us better results. And then the whole idea of lessons learned is a familiar concept usually to design engineers. They're already getting this from your quality data and your productivity information. So again, putting it in the same format just makes it more accessible for them, easier for them, all of that. So now how do I do that? Well, I would start by identifying what do I do now that is most similar to what I'm going to be doing. And then once I identify that process or whatever it is, where are my risk levels within that? And then find out things that we did post implementation, modifications wise. What kind of fixes did we do after the design was done? Because the engineers, they might not go back and look at those modifications that were made. They might just go back and look at the drawings that they had last time and start from there, in which case you're going to be stuck implementing the same fixes that you did the last time, right? So what modifications were made? And again, just making sure that we make it easy for them to know what these things were that we're done with it and relaying that to them. And then sometimes there's just things that we couldn't modify reasonably in that other design because we need to do a complete redesign or just wasn't financially feasible. So if we can find out what root causes weren't addressed and document those, and more importantly, prioritize those, that's going to be super helpful. So for example, looking at that process, if there were, 3 most important things from a root cause standpoint that we could address in a new design, what are they? And then make sure that the design engineers know that. So, similar to what I just talked about, our design out process is typically very reactive. We do the risk assessment, we identify the direct causes, we prioritize the jobs to improve, we implement the improvement, we assess the job to determine if it reduced the risk, and so on and so forth. But alternatively, if we incorporate those lessons learned into the design prior to bringing in the new piece of equipment or prior to creating the new line, we're going to be able to eliminate a lot of that risk ahead of time proactively, right? Instead of spending a lot of money to make those modifications and those redesigns after the fact, it's essentially low cost to no cost to make those changes when it's in the design phase. We only know those things if we've documented and shared those lessons learned. And then the idea of standardizing. So when you found a fix that's been successful, you verify that it's effective and you verify that the people doing the job, they like it, they accept it, they use the improvement on a regular basis. Once we know all that, now it's time to figure out where else can I use the same thing? And some of the challenges for that include awareness and exposure to what that thing is. So there's certainly opportunities here to think of this like more of a marketing activity. What can I do for posters about it? Or can I have pictures or videos or something playing on the TV in the lunchroom to just create that awareness and exposure to it? Can I have people talking about it? Maybe we can do some sort of internal competition among some of the best fixes to just, again, increase that awareness and exposure to that improvement that was made, and have people aware of, maybe bringing it into their process or things like that. On the other side of things, it's also important to determine similar activities. So where do I have similar operations, both in this facility, but also in other facilities across my organization? Because building that awareness and building that exposure can help with the people that are pulling for that solution in their area. But I also want to have processes in place to push that out to areas proactively, right? Hey, I know that you've got something that's really similar to this process that we have. So there might be something here that we did that you can incorporate over in your process as well. Right? So what's in place to standardize those kinds of things to ensure that we're redeploying those effective improvements. Okay, for the next little section here, I'm just going to talk through some bad habits for ergonomics teams, as well as some common process traps. Each of these, it's basically just a checklist of what not to do. And we've kind of spoken to each one of these throughout the session already. But the first one here being failing to consult the operator as the expert. This is a huge one. It's going to cause you a lot of headaches in so many ways if we don't do this. You might not get to the root of the problem. You might implement changes that don't actually fix things. You will probably have issues with buy-in. You're not going to have their engagement in the process if you haven't included them in the process, right? So ensuring that we're including the operator and taking in their feedback and all of that. Insufficient prioritization. So making sure that you're prioritizing not just the risk scores, but also the source of the risk and how it's impacting business and how it's impacting your stakeholders, right? I talked about wanting to demonstrate value to the organization. Well, what is it that would demonstrate value to your organization for your stakeholders? What are their expectations are? If you're just going with your gut all the time and you're not considering things like the risk score, where that risk is coming from, or how it may be impacting the business, you might be missing some really good opportunities to make changes that grow the process as a whole and fostering that awareness and buy-in as well. Skipping the root cause analysis. I still encounter situations where someone watches the job, they do the risk assessment, they identify the risk, and they go, I know how I want to fix this. I have this solution. It's going to be great. It's going to fix everything. And they think it's the perfect solution, but they skipped the root cause analysis. And I've seen some really big problems come out of that. They maybe fixed the wrong problem, or maybe they actually increased the risk because they didn't fully understand the process before they implemented this new thing that, again, just increased the risk somewhere along the way, or they just didn't reduce the risk at all and they don't understand why not. I implemented this tool, they're using this tool, why is my risk score not going down, right? We want to make sure that we're not skipping the root cause analysis, that we're understanding what the actual issue item at hand is. Limited follow-up. If you don't demonstrate risk reduction, it's going to be really hard to show the value of what you're doing in ergonomics, which is going to make the long-term success of the process a problem. Right? So we want to make sure that we're doing that follow-up to verify that risk reduction, because we also can't just assume that the solution we implemented worked. So if we don't do a follow-up analysis, we don't have any proof that we made an improvement. We've just made a change, and we don't know if that change was for the better or for the worse. It also means that we can't learn from the past. So I talked a lot about incorporating those lessons learned into design. We don't want to make the same mistake twice, but if we don't have the data to show that it was or wasn't a mistake, then we have no way of knowing whether or not it was the right decision to make, right? The whole point of what we're talking about here today is following that plan, do, check, act of a continuous improvement process. And you can't do the standardization and the act phase unless you've actually done the check and verified that what you thought was going to reduce risk did in fact reduce risk. When it comes to process traps, we have gaps in metrics reporting. So we want to make sure that what we're measuring and what we're tracking is actually what our stakeholders care about. Otherwise, our metrics aren't going to be helping us. So just ensuring, again, that we're in alignment with our stakeholders and what they are interested in, the story that they need to see. Also thinking about the format or the location of how these reports are being sent out. If we're only sending reports out in like a PowerPoint format and no one looks at that, that's not going to be very helpful. If we post these reports in like a Teams channel that no one has notifications turned on for, that's not going to help us. So we want to think about what's going to be the most effective format and location for these reports to actually get that awareness and buy-in that you need. And then the last item there, relying solely on those lagging metrics and our activity measures, you need to be doing both to show your progress over time. Incorrect mix of ergonomics team members. Said this quite a few times now, but frontline employees need to be represented. If we don't have them on our team, we've lost a huge wealth of information that could be helping us. We've lost a huge perspective there. But on the flip side of things, we also don't want to over rely on them. They have a lot of responsibility. They can't own everything. So it needs to be a nice balance there. But essentially, just making sure that we have that cross-functional input on our team, and that our team is trained in what they're supposed to be doing, and that they have actual sufficient time that is allocated and is known and agreed upon by their managers and supported by their managers to dedicate to those activities. And then the last two items here, failing to incorporate ergonomics into design and purchasing requirements. Again, talked about this when we talked about incorporating lessons learned, but making sure that you're also incorporating ergonomics into what's coming into your plant, right? If we're only fixing existing problems and we're not addressing any of the design or the purchasing processes that made those problems to begin with, and we're just constantly implementing fixes, we're not feeding that information back, and we're just going to be in this cycle of, you know, replicating all these improvements again and again, when we could hopefully just address that at the design phase when it's essentially low cost to no cost to make those changes. So just making sure that we're attacking both sides of the problem when we can. And then lastly, insufficient system for auditing. Again, everything that we've been talking about is around continuous improvement. So if you never audit your process, you never know how well it's functioning, and you could miss the opportunity to close gaps and make things better, have things run more smoothly and just get better over time. And that's important, but we'll only know that information if we're regularly auditing our process and have established that audit criteria. All right, send it back over to see what questions we have in the remainder of our time here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carly and Rick. It looks like we have about 13 or so minutes left for questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send it to everyone. The first question I saw that came in was asking, does a program exist for iPhone or Android with Velocity EHS?
For some of our solutions, yes, not for the ergonomics assessment.
Okay, sounds good. The next question I saw came in while Carly was discussing the slides on the lowest scoring elements. Were these research findings based on proprietary primary research, or were they based on available survey instruments that were peer reviewed?
So that's with regards to the self-assessment responses, I'm guessing.
I
Those
think
were,
so.
yeah. So those were companies filled out our online self-assessment, and we took that data and analyzed that data directly. Don't know if that answers the question.
I just saw the person said the PDCA findings is what they were referring to.
PDCA findings.
Yeah, that would be what you covered, Carly.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. The next question I saw is, how can this program factor in anthropometrics for 1,000 workers in North and South America, Africa, the EU, or Asia? Should this be an important factor overall? And this person had a follow-up question about what about health status, such as previous occupational injuries?
all right, so the first one, Carly gave some examples of design guidelines there, and one of the keys to applying design guidelines is you need to use ones that are appropriate to the population that you are targeting the use for. So there are design guidelines that are for different parts of the world, and if you're putting together a global program, you should use the ones appropriate to where the equipment is going in place rather than, necessarily where it's being purchased. Or if you're looking at equipment that's going to be able to be used in multiple locations or moved between locations, potentially, then it needs to be built within those ranges that would cover all the populations that are intended for it. Um, Generally speaking, we talk about designing for like 95% of the population, rather than some of the outliers. Um, Carly, do you want to take the second part of that on the pre-existing conditions?
Um, I'll let you go first, Rick, if you don't mind.
Okay, no, that's fine. Sorry to toss
All
that to you.
good.
No, the when we talk about designing for 95% of the population, that also comes into impact. Like, if you have a pre-existing condition, there's a good chance that you could fall outside of what that 95% could be in terms of strength capability or other elements. And those you should, within your policy, have something in place to also deal with the case-by-case examples where you do have someone with a pre-existing condition. And this is where aspects like understanding your job requirements and having pre-employment screening can be a useful step in the process.
Great, thank you. The next question I saw, this participant says, I work as an EHS supervisor from Kenya, and currently I struggle to collect data from ergonomic surveys in the form of numbers, which can help determine if there is an improvement a couple of months down the line. Can your program be able to help me undertake this task? And if so, is it something I can easily access?
So I'm guessing when we're talking about program here, we're talking about the self-assessment, the online self-assessment that I was talking to. If not, just stop me. But basically, one of the great outcomes of that self-assessment is figuring out where those gaps might be to help improve that and have it be more effective. So it could potentially help you hone in on those areas specifically and dive into and build up that specific area that you're needing to address there and be proactive in all of that. Maybe I've misinterpreted the question though, so Rick, feel free to add your thoughts, obviously, as well.
Well, I was going to be taking that the other direction and looking at it as it related to the improvement of individual jobs rather than the improvement of the program. Both are very valid challenges with it. And what you would do in documenting those, I mean, um, nearly any of the assessments will help you document that you're on the right track because you're able to show changes from an assessment standpoint, whether that's an office assessment, whether that's a manufacturing one, whether it's material handling specific. Any of those ones can show that you're on the right track. And then comes the aspects of down the road demonstrating the aspects like, reduction in number of employees experiencing pain, number of employees reporting injuries, and so forth.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question I saw is, how frequently should a program assessment of the type you described be performed?
I don't think there's no one size fits all in my opinion. It really depends on your organization and the size of your organization and at what level you also want to be implementing the program self-assessment. Obviously, we should be auditing probably annually or every 2 years or something like that, right? Using that tying in that evidence component and things like that. And so something that I recommend, because an audit is so labor intensive, is using the program self-assessment in more of those off years when it comes to your auditing schedule and auditing frequency. So if you're doing an actual full-blown audit by an independent third party or whatever every second year, maybe you implement doing this program self-assessment in those off years. So you're doing a full-blown audit this year, 2025, self-assessment in 2026, and that kind of thing. Again, there's no one size fits all. I also like doing the program self-assessment for quick checks along the way to see, are we progressing to where we're hoping to be, and we're not going to be surprised by our audit results. Maybe you want to see how different sites are doing. That's kind of my thought on frequency with regards to the program self-assessment.
Yeah, I think the only piece I'd add to that, and I fully agree with what you were saying there, is you need to look at how rapidly things are changing within your organization as it relates to what's happening in ergonomics. So if if you're at the stage where things are changing, um, pretty quickly, every year might be the right amount of time to do it. Um, but you might be in one where, it's been established for a while, it's working well, but the pieces of it are slow to change. I might stretch it out a little bit further than that.
Thank you both. Next question is, can you speak to a process for ensuring ergonomic review of new purchases, such as office furniture and computer equipment, vehicle seating, or power hand tools?
I don't know if Rick has any specific examples he can work in, but building it into process is going to be key, right? Having a procedure and process in place that those checks are happening is going to be key to doing those things.
Yeah, I think what I have found most effective in processes with that is um, you know, picking those things that are having the biggest impact for you organizationally, that you may be repeating somewhat often in terms of making those purchases and getting some real clear criteria to the purchasing department about what are the key elements that need to be there uh, for um, for something to be minimally acceptable, I think is the key element there, rather than just deciding on price that there's a set of elements that you have to have to accept it.
You have another question. What would you say is the most important leading indicator to focus on when evaluating the effectiveness of your ergonomics program?
I'll start off here, Rick, and then you can take it if you want. Again, kind of like my response from a question before, it heavily depends on your organization, in my opinion, as well as the maturity level of your organization. So I think Rick spoke really well to this, one of the slides about leading indicators and outcomes and things like that as well, right? A less mature company may be more focused on leading KPIs that are telling them that they're headed in the right direction and heading towards risk reduction, but maybe aren't necessarily looking at risk reduction yet, right? So are you getting folks trained up? Is that awareness training there? Are the ergo team members able to perform the assessments? Have we started performing assessments? And then the more mature we get, maybe we're looking at percent of assessments with improvements identified. And are those improvements engineering controls, right? So once we get to the risk reduction aspect of things, we're ensuring that we're going to have the biggest impact on getting that risk reduction. And then, 3, maybe 4 years, I don't want to put a full number on it, maybe 3, 4, 5 years down the road, now we're starting to look at things like risk reduction and verifying that risk reduction from those improvements implemented and follow-up assessments being done and things like that. So again, for me, there's no one size fits all when it comes to leading indicators. It's very dependent on the maturity of your process and also what's in your policy and plan and all of that as well.
Yeah, and I would back up as well to, what you've set out as your overall goal. Should be your, the overall aspect that you're driving to for what you want as a leading indicator. And then you're looking at the steps along the way. So, if my endpoint is I want to show um, that I've eliminated high risk tasks in the organization. Um, Before I get there, I'm going to have, for example, um, the number of jobs that I've reduced each month that were high risk and no longer are high risk. Before that, I might need just the number of engineering controls that I put in place. I'm going to need maybe the number of assessments that I've done before that. And so I'm usually looking from a program standpoint at the the next step in the process that gets me closer to what my end goal was that I set, and using that for the example. So, if I put one in place, I see the question in there, specific examples of a leading indicator. So I might have a goal for, let's say I'm running a program for a division or a corporation, and um, I ask that every facility document um, one or two jobs, depending on size of the facility, per month that they reduced from high risk to no longer high risk. And that's their goal, so one per month. And then I'm tracking how well they did that. And then that rolls up to, oh, well, we have, 12 facilities. So we got 12 of those a month. And it's going to take us 4 years to get to our goal at that rate, or whatever that happens to be. So that would be the type way I would set the goal and the target for that goal, and then track that progress across each of my facilities.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be sharing all questions from today's event with Velocity EHS. So if we didn't get to your question, please know that we will pass it along. My thanks to Carly Sorgini and Rick Barker for their presentation, to Velocity EHS for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. Please consider joining us tomorrow for our next Synergist event, a product demo focused on hearing conservation. You can register at aiha.webvent.tv, and hope everyone has a great day.